the United States has survived the trauma of 15 years of economic depression, followed by a war fought on two fronts. Americans are looking forward to an era of peace, healing, and growth. The future looks promising. The United States has emerged from the pit as the world's first superpower. At the end of the war, the United States is the only country in the world possessing the atomic bomb. It has the power to keep the peace. This sense of security proves to be short-lived. Almost instantly after the defeat of the Axis powers, the unity between the Soviet Russia and the other members of the Allied powers dissolves. But like most kids in the United States, young Richard Toye's life in the small Midwestern town of Glen Ellyn went on.
After World War II, I entered Benjamin Franklin School because we lived at 300 May Avenue in the southeast portion of Glen Ellyn at that time, not too far from about where all the fields started, between where we were and Roosevelt Road. In any event, as I said, I went to Ben Franklin Junior High School. Mrs. Florence Krager was the principal, and a lady named Glen Ellyn Anderson was my teacher. I went there through all of the grades and graduated from Ben Franklin at the 6th grade. Then we went to junior high school, which was now the City Hall building, but that was the junior high school of Glen Ellyn. So that we were there 2 years, and then I went to Glenbard, entered it in the class of 1955. It was a wonderful time. We played football, not the world's best. I ran track and ate an awful lot of cinders. But we just had a great time. We did ice skating on Lake Ellyn, and I think I skated more on my ankles than I ever did on the skates, and had a great time there. But the biggest thing, in my view, that happened in my senior year at Glen Ellyn, at Glenbard, was I met a neighbor's daughter. Became my wife, Sandy Toye. Sandy Dawn Swingle was her name. Sandra Dawn Swingle was her name. We met in 1955, and on a blind date that our mothers had arranged. After I graduated from high school in 1955, I was appointed by our representative at that time, U.S. representative, to admission to West Point. I took the exams, was there, and entered West Point in 1955 as a member of the class of 1959. I had 4 years there. There was a real shock on having to have the discipline of the U.S. Military Academy, and I think I fought it for probably 3.9 of those 4 years, but graduated and did okay, and selected the Air Force as my service. I went in as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. We were assigned immediately to Keesler Air Force Base down in Biloxi, Mississippi, and went to school for electronics. We also were told, hey, this is a good entry into missiles, because missiles were just entering into the Air Force at that time. So I graduated from that school thinking that probably missiles was where I was going to go in the not distant future. Thought about flight training, but missiles were the thing of the future then, they said. So I waited for my assignment to a school for missiles, and I got an assignment that came in to go to Spain.
Up until 1957, the bomber had been the only method for delivering nuclear weapons to their targets. But that year, the Soviet Union launched the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-7. The United States Air Force followed suit shortly afterwards in launching its own ICBM, the Atlas rocket. The Cold War had entered the space age. The These new weapon delivery systems did not replace conventional long-range bombers. They only added to both sides' growing arsenals. The race for strategic advantage continued heavily. In less than 15 years, the number of nuclear weapons had multiplied from only 2 to over 22,000. The bombers and nuclear-tipped missiles are strictly offensive weapons. They are not defensive in nature. The world had entered the atomic age. Post-war America was indoctrinated to be ever vigilant of nuclear attack from the evil Russian menace. The sword of Damocles was ever present. It had been burned into the American culture and psyche. People were all too aware that at any time, everything could be wiped out.
The chance of your being hurt by an atomic bomb is slight. But since there is a chance, you must know how to protect yourself. To protect yourself, you have to know what the bomb does. Besides blast, there's radioactivity and heat. Can we protect ourselves from these? These children are protected. Concrete walls help stop radioactivity. Any wall stops the heat. The heat scorches the house, but does not harm the children. Any solid gives some protection. The thicker it is, the better.
Say, what would we do if we didn't have a basement?
At school, they told us we should be away from windows and behind double walls, like an inside hall.
Ted's right. If you live in an apartment house, you can't all go to the basement. Head for a shelter area. If none is marked for you, find cover away from windows and in a hallway if possible. Wait for the all clear. Be calm.
In June of 1962, the United States Army constructed 12 guided surface-to-air Nike missile system installations in and around Chicago. The number of these sites grew to 23 stations by 1968. They were part of a defensive network of 300 or so sites spread across the entire country. They were meant to be the last line of defense against H-bomb carrying Soviet bombers that had eluded the Air Force interceptor jet aircraft. They were phased out of service and abandoned by 1971. Meanwhile, boards of education throughout the country, who had already had practice fire drills in place for decades, added bomb drills to their safety agendas. School children in large metropolitan areas were taught to duck and cover.
Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people, please. Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. First, you have to know what happens when an atomic bomb explodes. You will know when it comes. We hope it never comes, but we must get ready. It looks something like this. There is a bright flash, brighter than the sun, brighter than anything you've ever seen. If you were not ready and did not know what to do, it could hurt you in different ways. It could knock you down hard or throw you against a tree or a wall. It is such a big explosion, it can smash in buildings and knock signboards over and break windows all over town. But if you duck and cover like Bert, you will be much safer. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck and your face. Be like Bert. When there is a flash, duck and cover, and do it fast.
Remember what to do, friends. Now tell me right out loud. What are you supposed to do when you see the flash?
Duck and cover. Duck and cover. Duck and cover.
The arms race continued to balloon at a record pace up through the 1970s. Not only were the numbers of weapons growing to astronomical rates, but the destructive power of the largest warheads were many times stronger than the bombs dropped on Japan in 1945. There were enough stockpiled nuclear weapons to destroy the planet several times over. It was obvious to both sides that should anything trigger a nuclear exchange, neither side would survive. The state of affairs was referred to as mutual assured destruction. The world was teetering on a knife's edge. Something needed to be done, if not to stop the madness completely, to at least slow it down somewhat. In 1963, a limited test ban treaty, known as the LTBT, was signed by the United Kingdom, Moscow, and President Kennedy of the United States. The treaty addressed concerns of radiation pollution caused by nuclear weapons testing. The treaty prohibited open-air nuclear weapons testing. It also prohibited testing in outer space and underwater. It did not, however, limit underground testing. Below-ground testing of weapons continued by both sides. Talks between the superpowers did not end with the LTBT. Newer weapons being tested often had yields well above 150 kilotons. The conversation turned towards limiting the size of these weapons.
An opening occurred over at the State Department that was a designated opening for a military body. And I was selected that it was in the Office of Nuclear Policy and Operations. And they worked with all of the State Department aspects of our nuclear deployments around the world. And over there was a fascinating place because it was during that time that we started negotiating on the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, which meant that you could not detonate above 150 kilotons or 1,000 tons of TNT equivalent. And so it was my responsibility within that office to prepare testimony for the Secretary of State when he had to go on the Hill. Now, they certainly edited my drafts and all, but it was a fascinating time because of the dealing with all of the issues surrounding limiting nuclear testing, because there were many, many different interests around. There were, the State Department had one set of interests, the Pentagon had different sets of interests, the Department of Energy, which actually developed a lot of the nuclear weapons, had other interests. So as you go down to a new limitation on nuclear testing, there were a lot of tugs and pulls, and there were a series of tests that we had to have before the new agreement came into effect. And that was a lot of work to make sure all of those got done before the new test ban limits came in. So that was a very interesting time and a busy time, and a lot of things going back and forth to the National Security Council.
In 1974, President Richard Nixon and General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev signed the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. The TTBT set a maximum limit of 150 kilotons of TNT on the yield of underground nuclear explosions. These treaties, the LTBT and the TTBT, limited the development of ever more powerful weapons and ended testing fallout. But more importantly, they helped to plant the roots of trust between Moscow and the White House, so that reaching agreements to curtail the proliferation of nuclear arms would have a chance for success.
Okay, as I said, I was in the Pentagon for 2 years, State Department for 2 years, and at the end of the 2 years at State Department, I was selected for a program that the Air Force had called, it was a fellowship at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So I had a one-year assignment as a research associate at the Fletcher School. I had gone because of my dealing with nuclear weapons. I did not teach a whole course. I taught a couple of lessons in a course on the way you can think about programming how many nuclear weapons you have to deal with a particular target set. And it's very mathematical on that kind of thing, and it was a very interesting year of that Fletcher School. After the fellowship at Fletcher, I thought I would go back into the Air Force, but it didn't quite work that way either. I was selected to go to the National War College at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. So I graduated from the National War College at the class of 1979, and from there I was reassigned to Grand Forks, North Dakota. And that is really north, and the reason I was reassigned there, it had both a bomb wing, that was with the B-52 bombers, and a ballistic missile field, which was the 321st Strategic Missile Squad Division. And we had, our missile field was spread over an area roughly the size of New Jersey. It was, because obviously you don't want any missile so close that one missile coming in could destroy two missiles of yours. So they were all over the eastern part of North Dakota. And it was a fascinating assignment to be responsible for all of those. And North Dakota was also an interesting place. Winter up there was beyond brutal. And they told me one time, they said, you know, when you are out here in the winter time, when it gets to 10 below zero, it's going to feel warm to you. And I said, never. And I was there where the lowest temperature I ever dispatched troops out to the missile field was about a wind chill of about minus 90 degrees. It really was brutal. And you know, we were running often at 40 below zero and 35 below zero. And by golly, one day it hit about 9 below zero. And I thought, boy, this feels fairly warm. So this thing that I could not have believed when the guy told me it'll feel warm at 10 below, it did. And that was a strange, strange thing. But that was a wonderful assignment. And going out, I was able, during that time, of course, to visit all of my on-site missile field, as well as my launch control centers, which were all over that same part of North Dakota. To understand what it's like to see that many really loaded weapons that were ready to go. Thank God we never have had a shot fired in anger, but they are ready. And now we have reduced the number of them, and that was done through the Nuclear Arms Control Agreement that was negotiated with the Soviets, called the START Agreement. I'll talk to that in just a second.
In May of 1982, the Soviet Russia and the White House meet in Geneva, Switzerland, to resume strategic arms negotiations. President Ronald Reagan renames the talks START. He proposes the talks exceed mere limitations on existing stockpiles of missiles and warheads, calling instead for extreme reductions in their numbers. The talks start and stop over the next few years. In 1985, the START talks resume. In 1991, the Strategic Arms Reduction Agreement is signed by U.S. President George H.W. Bush and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. But in December of that year, the Soviet Union dissolves, leaving in its wake 4 independent republics: Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Russia. Each has its own stockpile of strategic nuclear weapons. In May of 1992, all of these countries sign onto the treaty. The treaty defined mandatory verification measures, which included on-site inspection. By 1997, Belarus and Kazakhstan had destroyed all of their nuclear warheads, and the Ukraine destroyed its last ICBMs in 1999. In the same year, both the United States and Russia would have reduced their nuclear stockpiles to only 7,950 warheads. The great arms race had not only come to its end, it had reversed course. We had stepped back from the brink.
But the START agreement, strategic arms reduction talks, caused the missile field at Grand Forks, North Dakota, to be removed, because that was more weapons than we were allowed to have. And then there was a procedure for how you had to damage the silos in which these missiles were located so that they could be examined by satellites to be sure that they were really destroyed. Fascinating time. After I left Grand Forks, North Dakota, I was assigned to the Joint Staff of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon in Washington. And I became the director of the division of that was called Nuclear Negotiations. I was the chief of the Nuclear Negotiations Division, and I was responsible there for the strategic arms talks, the intermediate range nuclear forces, INF talks, and then the various and sundry nuclear test ban treaties. When I say I was responsible for them, I was the office on the joint staff of the Joint Chiefs of Staff responsible for that part of it. We had an interagency group that brought together the State Department, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, CIA, other organizations, the military and all, so that we could work out programs and issues at that level and then get them approved by our bosses, and then that would work its way up. And if there was a dispute between agencies, it would be able to be laid out very clearly for President Reagan so he could make the choice of yes, no, or whatever the issue was. But it was a wonderful assignment. I was there for 5 years. I was in Geneva for the opening round of the Strategic Arms Reduction talks, and it was a fascinating time. We started out, and I'm going to try to wrap all of this into a very short discussion because it ties together. We and the Soviets were just not very friendly with one another at that point, as you can imagine. And as the negotiations wore on, and we would be there for maybe a month or 6 weeks, and then back here in our respective countries, them to Russia, us to here, to say, okay, now what do we do? Because we have one side feeling this way, the other side this way. How do we try to come closer with that? And we would be back maybe for 3 months or so, working these issues, and then go back to Geneva. It was a fascinating time, and little by little, in my mind, and I will not speak for anybody else, and I don't know that anybody feels this way, but I felt this way. All of a sudden, or gradually, I guess, we and our Soviet counterparts became somewhat involved in wanting to see whatever it was we did succeed. It's a human nature. The thing you're involved in, you'd like to see it reach fruition. And so I don't think we would have ever fallen in love with one another, but I will say that I think we started to do some joint work together to try to solve some of these problems. And indeed, after the arms control, after the Strategic Arms Start 1 reduction treaty was approved, there was an organization called the On-Site Inspection Agency. And the Russians and the Americans worked on that. We could go in and inspect anywhere we wanted to. They could inspect where they wanted to. And one of my people that worked for me after I retired, he became a member of that on-site inspection agency. And I was invited to his retirement ceremony. He was an Army colonel. I was invited to his retirement ceremony. And what was so interesting was half of the people there were from the Russian military, and half of the people there were from the US military. And as you always do in the military, when you retire, everybody gives you a plaque and this and that. And doggone if the Russians didn't give them plaques also. And I thought, there is hope that maybe we can do something with this. Now, whether that can ever be revived or not, I don't know. But it was a wonderful experience on how the U.S. interagency works, how it is to sit across the table from the Russians and talk off the record. I mean, nothing is really off the record, but nobody could say any off the record things and make you have to do them. It was just a train of thought, but it was a fascinating time, and one that I thought just was about as fulfilling as anything I've ever done, because while I retired before the Strategic Arms talks were signed, I knew all the players, and I knew what those signatures meant. And then, since I was also responsible for the INF portion of it, when it came to fruition and became a signed treaty, I knew what that meant for us, and likewise on various test ban treaties for the nuclear testing. So it was a wonderful time, just a fascinating time, and one where I felt that we and the Soviets used some good judgment and did a good job for our not only countries, but I would like to think for the world.
START was not the last arms reduction negotiations. Talks continued. On April 8, 2010, an agreement was reached on a new treaty that would limit both the United States and Russia to 1,550 deployed strategic warheads each. Can disarmament continue? Perhaps. In either case, the world is a safer place than it was 50 years prior at the height of the arms race. War is an easy thing to make, but peace is a much harder thing to keep. This is why we owe the unsung heroes of peace, like Glen Ellyn's Colonel Dick Toye, our never-ending gratitude and thanks. Want to learn more about this and hundreds of other fun and interesting stories from Glen Ellyn's past? Drop by Stacy's Corner Store, located in the Glen Ellyn History Center at 800 North Main Street. Stacy's Corner Store carries a complete selection of books about Glen Ellyn's history. Add them to your library today.